And you pause for a moment because you've been speaking for a very, very long time. Does the audience care? Have you worn them down? Are there even people who have been there from the beginning? Is this a whole new audience? Are the subjects completely unknown to them? But you rally. You realize everything you've said is on the record, and so you tell them. This is episode 300 of Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, a podcast about technology, history, and getting myself out of debt. Thanks to Daniel Boyd, Jeff Atwood, and the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. 300 of anything becomes something you notice when you're archiving or going through collections that people have built up. It's one thing to find a handful of books or a handful of cassette tapes, but 300 tells you that somebody had an interest. They had some sort of motivation for doing so much. I've been classifying sets of items on the Internet Archive for nearly 15 years now. There's a moment of respect when I notice that somebody has created 300 of anything. So here we are. I've been talking about myself, my history, and my thoughts on many different subjects for between 10 and 30 minutes at a stretch, nearly every week for about 6 years. Have I learned anything? Well, I've got a few thoughts that may be of use to people who are thinking about their own projects or their own relations to work that they do. First of all, nothing is more humbling than starting out by putting a towel over my head in my closet and trying to both determine whether or not I have the right tone of voice and I'm talking about the most interesting things, while simultaneously making sure that nobody in the house is making any noise, that no socks or shoes fall on me, and that I don't rustle all of the coats that are sharing the space with me. I've also learned that an Isovox recording booth, while very helpful for giving you the sound isolation you can later work with, also means that it gets very, very hot, very, very quickly. And so it's weird to emerge from a podcast sweating, both because I'm activating the part of my brain that's trying to make sure that everything makes sense and flows in an appropriate manner, and also I am very, very slowly cooking myself. It is not easy to come up with 4 subjects every week for years on end. The way that I do it has always been to reach out to what's on my mind immediately and currently, and then every once in a while cast my mind back to events and places that affected me that I feel I've never really told anybody. The effect of the first is that I feel I've really processed some things, some subjects, some questions that I otherwise probably would have put to the back burner or never considered at all, and also digging deep into trauma, memory, and just experiences of previous phases of my life has sort of let me archive those feelings as well. I've not yet discussed every terrible thing that's happened to me, and I haven't yet discussed every wonderful thing either. What that means, how I've thought about it since. But when I do, it's like I've given it one last moment in the sunshine of my thoughts, and I can put it away, everything reaching a conclusion. Perhaps it's weird that the conclusion for some of these stories is that I talked about them in a sort of retirement dinner and then put them away, but I've also found my mind lightening. I'm rapidly becoming less of a series of traumatic or intense memories and becoming more of a person working day to day on what matters to him and then thinking about what's mattering in the weeks or months or years to come. To that end, It's been an enormous success. I have been able to break through a bunch of intractable problems, and I've been able to discuss things that I thought nobody really would care about, and then get feedback from folks who are listening to the podcast at whatever time they do, and sending me letters or comments about what they think of what I'm talking about. I didn't know exactly what the podcast was going to be about. It might have been a simple history fest where I read a Wikipedia article to you, or maybe it would have been a series of free-form, disconnected memories of my own experience. I try to mix things up, to tell you things that I know definitely happened, but more importantly, to realize that all technology stories are human stories. They involve humans, they interface with humans, they work their way through the human lifetime and the human spirit. In a kind of strange way, it's almost religious in terms of how you think of things as a series of relics and tales and stories and lore, but your day-to-day interaction with other people are informed by it, and, you hope, gives you a positive foundation from which to build your own decisions. I couldn't sit down and recount in some sort of quantitative report exactly how I've been in terms of generosity, empathy, or competence over the last few years related to the years before that, but the strict discipline of having to discuss motivations, many of them going back 20, 30 years, has been, I like to think, incredibly revelatory. We are made of the stories that people tell about us and our own stories about ourselves. My story is somebody who lost a lot of things when he was very young and resolved that whatever he could do, he would preserve the lores and tales, even the sad or fringe ideas, and put them somewhere for others to walk through and regard. I've had the opportunity to go through a whole variety of museums, reliquaries, and displays created by people who wanted a sort of autonomous truth-telling to exist on a wall or a building or a website. The urge to do that is my own urge as well. Creating how-tos and here we are and where are we going, and then laying them out for an unknown audience of listeners who I think ultimately will be few but very precious. I'm a little bit worried that I'm going to forget when I have told a story before. Not revisited and added to, but that I actually engage in a front-to-back, complete repetition of something I've talked about before. One of those weird projects I may do would be to feed transcriptions of all of my podcasts into some sort of informational graphing software, of which there's many, and produce a mind map of what I have discussed and the themes that I return to. But there's one parable that reaches out to me that has guided me for over 20 years. And it came at a time when I could be saying to have a crisis of faith as to whether the work I was doing, setting things up, placing them out for the world, and waiting, was worth it. And it's the tale of the broken strings. There was a zither master who could play the zither so well, and people really enjoyed his work. But there was one listener who mattered the most to him, his best friend, his neighbor, who would come over and just listen to him playing this stringed zither. Your notes are like the sound of the ocean. Oh, we are traveling over a mountain, he would say, as his friend quietly played his instrument. And then one day, his friend died, and the master of his instrument tearfully destroyed his zither because he realized it wasn't just the notes he was playing, but how they were being heard, and he had lost the true meaning. of where the heart and the soul of his playing had come from. I think about this constantly because there are times that I get emails from people who I couldn't tell what we would be like in person. I don't know how we would get along. But they write notes to me about how they're affected by what I do, what I talk about, the projects I've been involved in, the different ideas I've put out in essays. And it strikes me that their responses, not necessarily their support, not that they agree with me, but the fact that they look deeper into what I'm going off about, this supposedly shallow essay, or this very strange blog entry, or this very strange site, or this very strange set of tweets, or weird things I've said. And I realize that they are that person who, more than the work I'm doing, are the kind of person, silent but sometimes not, who is going to provide the second half of what I'm doing. It's not enough that I can go through a week and go through 10,000 items and describe them or have scripts that do work with me. It's not enough that I pile up different stacks of documents or rip through VHS tapes or go through cassettes or floppy disks and create them into images. It's that second person, a person who may not even overlap with my lifespan, who is the person who makes it all real, makes it worthwhile, makes it sing. Doesn't matter how loud I play my zither if there aren't listeners at the other end. You are probably that listener. Something I've done, something I've shared, something I've been involved in that people may not know that I'm involved in. All of that. Without that, my strings are broken. Without that feeling of other human beings and what they brought to the table, even as passive listeners, is the real reason of what's driven me this far, what has caused me to create hours and hours of talking about myself. When this podcast was started, I was in a very deep tax debt. I had thousands upon thousands of dollars to pay, and it felt hopeless. And I decided that I could look for something to sell, something to get funding for, and I decided that it would be easiest for me to tell tales. As it turns out, it has not always been easy. There have been times that I have been struggling to think about what I'm going to say next, where I'm cranky and annoyed that I'm going to have to get into that hot booth and talk about things. And there's been other times when I have been absolutely elated that this platform exists, that I have a moment when I can step into this quiet box and begin to tell a tale, and know that one or two or even 100 people are going to listen to me. It has been therapeutic. It has been wondrous. It has been infuriating and complicated and strange, impossible to quantify, and truly life-changing. I floated around the idea of stopping at 300. But the fact is, there are hundreds of people who listen to this podcast, and the money that comes in helps me pay for medical and rent and other costs that I could probably cover elsewhere, but it becomes so much easier and so much more meaningful to know that I paid those costs because I was able to tell a tale and somebody listened. So I'm continuing with this podcast. I think it's going to be something in my life for a while to come. It doesn't have to be a round number that I stop. It doesn't have to be a guest star rodeo full of all sorts of people saying my name. Instead, it's just going to be something I do for the foreseeable future, which, if I sit down and think about it, well, that's what life is, isn't it? This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, thanks to James Bekoyanu, Ernie Hershey, Michael Rubin, Dilip Reddy, Sean Kelly, Trixie the Cat, Martin, Sembiance, Benjamin Guts, Joey Mink, and Anonymous, along with the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me and keeping me and supporting me out of debt.